It has been an absolutely wild week for Starfield news and updates. This week during Gamescom, we learned a ton more about Starfield, like how the game's going to feature not only New Game Plus, but also extensive modability. We got numerous interviews with several of the higher-ups at Bethesda, and we've also seen some involvement in the leaks around Starfield. These leaks have been continuing to drop, and there even was an arrest made in connection to some of them. And hey, get subscribed, as in just 5 days I'll be able to post my full Starfield review, and after that review I'm going to do a stream to answer all of your major questions about the game. The main source of most of these new Starfield details and updates is Gamescom, where it really does seem like Starfield is stealing the show for a lot of people, which is pretty crazy because you can't even play Starfield there. The introductory portion of Starfield is being shown in a theater at Gamescom. The footage of this has definitely leaked online. It's being taken down quite consistently, but it's also consistently popping back up as hundreds of people are seeing these demos, and although you're not able to post this footage, you can talk about your thoughts. And IGN describes the Starfield presentation as roughly 15 to 20 minutes of a mission that seems to be one of the very first missions of the game, as well as it's condensed down a bit. So it's not like you're just seeing somebody play uncut gameplay of Starfield, but instead it's going to be one of the introductory missions edited a bit to make it quick and concise for the presentation. And it's described how in the gameplay we could see ourselves working as a miner. They describe finding the artifact very early on and having visions as a result. This likely being that exact same sequence we saw in the Direct, perhaps with some updates in the time in between. And after finding the artifact, having these visions, you're going to black out and wake up in the character creator. Shortly after all of this occurs, you're able to go outside and explore a bit on this little moon planet, but then Barrett is going to arrive and you're encouraged to go to Constellation and describe the experience you just had with the artifact. And from there, it's described how you could see us going to space and even arriving at the next location where Constellation is. It seems like the demo is going to cut right at this opening sequence at the door of Constellation. And although this doesn't necessarily reveal a ton, I mean, a lot of fans, including myself, were able to put together this timeline of starting out as a miner, finding the artifact, going to Constellation, just from what we saw in the Direct. But if this truly was just a 15 to 20 minute demo, even if it did have some cuts in it, but you still were able to access a spaceship and go to an entirely different planet, it certainly sounds like the game's going to open up relatively early on. Like you're going to have some freeform experiences relatively early on, which is definitely a positive. If anything, some past Bethesda Game Studios games have been way too locked down for way too far into the game. And overall, most of the initial reports from this very short demo are tons of positive feedback. And reportedly, even just the line to watch this 15 to 20 minute demo is 3 hours long, as well as the line to get into Gamescom has been massive over the past couple of days, at least based off reports online. But several of the higher-ups from Bethesda were also at Gamescom. We got to hear from both Todd Howard and Pete Hines, who each shared their own new details about the game. Todd Howard describes how at this point Starfield is basically done, which, yeah, I would hope so, and they're really just making minor tweaks on the game. With him describing Starfield as one of those games where you sit down to just play for about a half hour, and then suddenly 3 hours went by and you're still playing. With Pete Hines going a bit more in depth as far as new details on Starfield. The interviewer here brings up how giving Starfield to reviewers so early is generally going to be a good sign for the game. And Pete Hines expands on this to say that with this game, almost no amount of time feels like enough. Pete Hines mentions that he is over 150 hours into the game and hasn't even come close to experiencing everything, saying that the feedback from players is how they really cannot believe how big it actually is. Even despite the fact that the entire time Bethesda has been saying this is a giant game or even irresponsibly large, even as people get their hands on it, they're still surprised by the scale. And the real bulk of the new details came from this Bethesda official stream with Pete Hines and the Bethesda Germany team. Pete talks about how a few hours into Starfield, you'll start to understand what parts of the game are for you, such as when it comes to ship combat. Maybe you're somebody who just doesn't enjoy ship combat at all. Well, then you could use the grav drive to simply jump away from it. It seems like this is a larger analogy for Starfield. There's going to be a ton of features in this game, and you don't have to do all of them. There's going to be a variety that you could just avoid or ignore outright if you're not interested in them. But the game is so big that that's going to be perfectly okay, and there's still plenty of content to keep you occupied even if you skip a few things. As well as another testament to the scale of this game is Pete Hines claims that telling somebody how many hours they've played of Starfield really tells you almost nothing about what they've done. He mentions in the past how Todd Howard asked Pete Hines his thoughts on the main story of Starfield after Pete Hines had 80 hours of playtime, but in reality Pete Hines hadn't even done the main quest yet, which is pretty insane. 80 hours hours in and not even being most of the way through of the main story speaks volumes to the scale of this game. But this also continues to suggest to me that early on the game will open up and allow you to go on your own path, because if you're able to put 80 hours in without getting much into the main quest, it likely means the main quest is largely avoidable if you don't want to do that right away. And we even get a bit more of a cryptic quote from Pete here, where he does say that the game doesn't even really get going until after you finish the main quest. And he expands on this to say it is his favorite Bethesda Game Studios story ever, and his favorite ending to a Bethesda Game Studios story ever. But Starfield still does have restrictions. Some things require skills to use, like the literal in-game skills, with spaceships being used as an example here. You can't pilot a Class 3 ship without the right piloting skills first. And with how skills work in Starfield, this has to be done in a literal sense. You're going to need to unlock and then use those skills. With what we've seen from some of the past gameplay, you unlock the skill, but then you actually have to use it and complete the challenge associated with it to get to the next level, to have the ability to unlock rank 2. So in this example, to be able to use better spaceships, you need a better pilot skill, but to get to a better pilot skill, you have to have done a ton of flying. So it's almost like you're naturally becoming a better pilot, and in turn, you're going to get a better spaceship, or at least have access to one. Companions in Starfield also got expanded, and we hear about how they're going to disapprove of your actions dependent on their personality. And one example given is one of the companions isn't going to like if you're just picking a bunch of locks and is going to disapprove of you the entire time. In a separate GQ interview that we're going to talk about in a moment, we got confirmation that Starfield even adds in a unique and exciting twist on New Game Plus to incentivize continued and repeat play. This being a feature Bethesda games have desperately needed for years and is basically always modded in some capacity. But Pete Hines expands on New Game Plus here, mentioning that's going to be tied to the main story. It's not entirely clear if he means you have to beat the main story to get New Game Plus, or if it's just going to be tied to the main story or relevant to it. And he describes that New Game Plus in Starfield is special and really spoilery, so it's something fans should experience for themselves, and he's not going to talk about it here. You're also going to encounter a lot of emergent stuff in space. There are tons of ships and star stations you will come across. It sounds like there's going to be quite a few new space random encounters in addition to some of the new ground random encounters. Also this week, Bethesda published another developer interview with Zach Wilson, this being one of the devs from the Direct and being a senior level designer on the game, and he actually talks about ship encounters as well. We also have legendary ship encounters. These are huge, high-level enemy ships that will dramatically outclass the player through the early part of the game that you'll have to build up to be able to destroy. But even beyond that, there's going to be tons of derelict ships floating around. They're meant to depict the tragedies and perils of space travel. You're able to board these derelict ships and even discover the stories behind what happened to them. And some of these ship encounters even came from a modder with Chris Takahashi. This is a modder who was hired by Bethesda, best known for the Interesting NPCs mod for Skyrim and Tales from the Commonwealth for Fallout 4. In Starfield, you are going to be able to loot armor off of enemies. There's one of those weird ones in the Direct where sometimes you could see that there wasn't any armor to be looted while other times there was, but Pete Hines confirms here that looting spacesuits, helmets, and packs is a thing in the game, as well as you will be able to just get up and walk around in your spaceship as it floats in space. Pete doesn't think there's going to be any kind of level cap in Starfield, but he does say that as you level up in Starfield, you should be very thoughtful about where you spend your skill point, especially compared to previous Bethesda games. Due to the challenge requirements for upgrading skills, you should really prioritize spending skill points on things you're actually going to be using and that you'll level up. And one interesting comment from Pete is that with all of the skills, you cannot use it until you unlock it. Boost packing is the example where it seems like you can't actually use your boost pack or your jetpack in Starfield to fly around until you have the skill for it. Some of the members of the German community team even mentioned how a lot of people were confused about this at first, with some reporting that they got a jetpack and thought it was broken because they couldn't fly around, but in reality they just didn't have the appropriate skill. This is a pretty notable and interesting design decision for Starfield. Bethesda doesn't typically lock functionality behind skill unlocks. In past games, most of the time you just get to enhance your skills, but seemingly in Starfield you'll have to actually get the skill to be able to use the thing at all. In Starfield, there's going to be a museum tied to the United Colonies Vanguard quest, and Pete Hines highly recommends going to this early on, as it's going to describe what happened to Earth, and how things got to where they are right now. And to expand on that, Pete Hines describes how when humanity flocked to space, they didn't all go to the same areas, but instead there are different peoples with different ideals. Some are just farmers growing food to help others, but then you also have massive cities and even city-sized space stations. There's going to be mods for Starfield, and a creation kit will be released, but Pete Hines makes it clear there's going to be a post-launch thing and they have no other information to share at this time, but then he does share a bit more. As Pete Hines describes people making entire planets with these modding tools and how there's going to be a lot more content to come as communities get their hands on these tools. It definitely sounds like mod support's going to be a little bit down the road for Starfield, which is interesting. We just recently saw the Starfield EULA get updated with a mention of creation credits, making it seem like a paid mod-like system would be here relatively soon if it's already in the EULA, and even the ESRB rating had an in-game transactions listing. But if mod tools are still a ways away, perhaps paid mods are also still a ways away. Starfield will have mission boards where you can basically take odd jobs like transporting people or clearing things out in certain areas. He describes forgetting he accepted one of these missions where he had to transport somebody somewhere else. And all of a sudden, he walks back on his ship to find two people hanging out there, and he's completely perplexed as to who they are, only to remember, oh yeah, I accepted a job a while ago. This to really speak to how much content is in Starfield and how easy it is to get distracted from whatever you were doing first. And in passing, towards the end, Hines mentions how he heard from PC players that the game is running buttery smooth. But we also get confirmation that there is not going to be a making of Starfield documentary, similar to what they did for Fallout 76. Hines describing how they don't always repeat things from one game to another, and honestly, while I get it, I really would have loved to see a documentary on the making of Starfield. This is their first new IP in 25 years with a pretty insane 8-year development cycle with a lot of twists and turns along the way, a global pandemic, and also their entire company getting bought out. I think it would have made for a really cool behind the scenes look at the development of this game, and if anything, I would have much rathered a Starfield documentary compared to a Fallout 76 one. But even beyond just Gamescom, Starfield did receive a variety of other updates this week. An official release time map has been posted. Starfield will have a global release time, no need to travel to New Zealand for this one, and it's going to come out at 8 p.m. Eastern Time worldwide. Very notably, this is going to be exactly 8 hours after the review embargo does lift, and what this means is many of you out there will be able to play Starfield on the night of August 31st instead of having to wait until September 1st. In addition, the PC specs have been reiterated, and notably here, if you're playing on PC, even the minimum system requirements require an SSD. During the stream, Hines emphasized this, saying that if you don't have an SSD, make sure you get one as Starfield really does need it. But speaking of PC, we also got to hear a bit from AMD. One of the big unknowns right now with Starfield is whether or not it'll have DLSS support. Starfield is an AMD sponsored game, and many of these AMD sponsored games in the past have shipped without Nvidia's DLSS, which right now, DLSS is a clear superior to AMD's own FSR. But if Starfield does end up shipping without DLSS, the gaming chief at AMD wants you to know that this is Bethesda's fault, with him recently telling The Verge, if they want to do DLSS, they have AMD's full support. There's nothing blocking Bethesda from adding it to the game. All of this was around AMD's recent teasing of FSR 3, that being the most recent update to their upscaler, which seems like it's going to dramatically improve performance and perhaps finally bring FSR up to scale with DLSS. Although at this time, it's not even entirely clear if FSR 3 will come to Starfield, although with it being a sponsored game, it's very likely. But even if FSR 3 does come to Starfield, it's not really clear when this would be coming out. Perhaps it'll be a surprise edition on release, which would be epic and really cool for all players on PC. But again, as of right now, we really don't know. And Starfield leaks have continued over this past week. We've seen gameplay, screenshots, as well as a mountain of details posted online. And one of the most interesting sources of all of this was Tyrone. The first extended piece of Starfield gameplay to leak featured a character named Tyrone. And it turns out that wasn't just a character name, that was literally the name of the person who created the leaks in the first place. And it was gradually revealed that this person was seemingly stealing copies of Starfield as they were being shipped out. It's not entirely clear how, but basically intercepting shipped out copies of the game and then reselling them online. So you could find an entire storefront where he sold numerous copies of Starfield for hundreds of dollars. And one user on Reddit even reported buying one of these and actually receiving a working copy of the game. Except in the process of all of this, Tyrone ended up getting quite a bit of attention drawn to him. We saw his Xbox get shut down by Microsoft at one point, and now there's seemingly an arrest record with the same individual for theft of property, likely meaning Tyrone is now in jail for stealing and selling Starfield copies. So yeah, an absolutely wild saga for the Starfield leaks, and something that is certainly going to be memed for years into the future. And even beyond all of that, with the sketchy selling of the game, there have also been people just receiving copies of the game perfectly legally, including the Constellation Edition, which has now had a full unboxing of it posted on YouTube. If you're interested in checking that out, I'll have a link down below. But we also got to hear a bit more from Todd Howard, as well as some of the other top-level devs at Bethesda in a recent interview from GQ. And it seems like the author of this GQ article was also able to play Starfield for about 8 hours. They describe 8 hours playing Starfield shows why. The game is the team's most polished ambitious in scope and original in tone in recent memory, which is some pretty high praise, and it's even followed up by the lead animator exclaiming that they would release the game today, which really does seem to reflect an insane degree of polish with Starfield, especially compared to past Bethesda games. We get some interesting commentary on the game's NASA punk style. It described how Starfield is the future, but a grounded one. There aren't holograms everywhere, it's got buttons, they're tactile. You want to press them. Don't think of it as futuristic, think of it as a period piece. These are things that happened, people are still people, they're still messy. We've heard how Starfield will get into some of the more serious topics, and it seems like the design of this had a genuine impact on some of the devs. Emil, the design director, describes how he never reflected so much while making a game, and now his own religious beliefs have even changed during development, described as being push-pulled from atheist to agnostic. Is there anything out there but blackness? We're tackling some pretty big themes that your average shooter probably doesn't get into. It's really affected me personally. And in this interview, we of course did get that mention of New Game Plus coming to Starfield as a unique way to enable repeat play of the game, but repeat play of Starfield may be a while down the road, as the interviewer here describes how in just 45 minutes within New Atlantis, they already had 12 quests leading them off-world. One has me smuggling contraband from the mining colony of Sidonia on Mars to gain the trust of the deadly Crimson Fleet. And this is described as the biggest change-up with Starfield, the exploration. We've heard countless times from various interviews how Starfield's still going to have Bethesda Game Studios' DNA, but here we hear how the biggest departure from that DNA will be the new ways of exploring. Because of the nature of spreading a universe across dozens of planets, exploration is both broader and more transient than the open worlds of previous BGS games. And Todd Howard even describes how he is not sure everyone will like this change in rhythm. And in this, Todd Howard even mentions how he's been offered to go to space in the past, but is holding out until he is older. But thankfully, Todd Howard makes it clear that retirement is still a ways away, which I think is definitely a good thing for all of us fans to hear. And we even get to hear a bit about the Elder Scrolls 6 from Todd Howard, with him mentioning how he regrets announcing the Elder Scrolls 6 when they did. I've asked myself that a lot. I don't know. I probably would have announced it more casually, which makes sense to me. The Elder Scrolls 6 getting a full trailer treatment back several years ago now made a lot of people feel like it would be coming sooner than it really was. If we compare this to how things with Fallout 5 are being handled, where yeah, it's been mentioned in a couple of interviews now, but there are very little in the way of expectations. Where for me, I still constantly see users asking about what's going on with the Elder Scrolls 6 when they may not even realize production on the game hasn't even really started in a major way yet. And Todd Howard continues on to describe the Elder Scrolls 6 as, I will say that we wanted to fill that role of the ultimate fantasy world simulator, and there are different ways to accomplish that given the time that has passed. The GQ article was definitely interesting, but it was pretty obviously a fluff piece, or at least the interviewer came off as super biased to me, which I felt the need to mention just because of how extreme this was. I mean, he describes Todd Howard as slight, boyishly handsome, sharp-jawed, and touzle-haired. He has the look of classical antiquity. As the studio's leading man since the early noughties, he's become a semi-mythical figure to gamers who hang off of his every word. Now 52 years old, the only real sign of him being flesh and bone are some faint bags under his sea blue eyes. He is reserved but not at all shy, talkative but never all that forthcoming, especially about his life outside of games. Yeah, so link down below if you want to read the full article, which has a lot of that. With that said, those are your updates on Starfield. If you're interested in learning more, we've had several other updates this week, and you can check out those videos here.